Watch The Atheist Experience live Sundays at 4:30 p.m. Central. Visit tiny.cc/YTAXP and call into the show at 512-991-9242 or connect to the show online at tiny.cc/callaxp.
It's time to get sexy on Secular Sexuality.
Hello and welcome to Secular Sexuality, the ACA show that refuses to watch another goddamn claymation special this year. I'm Christy Powell, and I'm joined tonight by writer, researcher, and friend of the show, Dianna Anderson. Welcome,
Hi.
Dianna.
Hi, I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, super excited to have you back. You know, I'll be honest, the inspiration for this episode probably started when I ran across one of your 10-year-old TV recap articles, and you're doing that for a living. So tonight we're going to be turning to our resident sex-positive film critic to see if we can find anything to watch with the family this holiday season that isn't just like the same scratched up DVD copy of the Santa Claus. So give us a call with your questions, with your thoughts, with your stories. We're at 512-991-9242, or you can catch us at tiny.cc/callsex because the show is coming right now. All right. Well, that sound means that we are starting this week the way we do every week with what is turning us on this week. And I'm a little overexcited because I never actually get to answer these. But because it's just you and I, Dianna, I'm going to go ahead and jump in and make sure to mention season 5 of Big Mouth, which just came out. It is a really good time. If you haven't caught Big Mouth, it may seem at first blush, and maybe kind of is, just another one of those raunchy late night Rick and Morty style cartoons. And that's a valid hit. If that doesn't really play for you, I get it. But this one has something to it. There's just so much going on. There's so much conversation, good modeling, really, of dialogue around sexuality. It's about a bunch of young kids who are sort of discovering their sexuality throughout adolescence as they grow. And it explores a lot of emotional themes that, I gotta tell you, as a therapist, I find myself being like, oh my God, I have never put it that succinctly before. Like, the Greta toad helps to defeat the anxiety mosquito. It's cheesy as shit at times, but man, if it isn't good medicine, I absolutely love it.
Yeah, I really enjoy that show too. The hormone monsters and stuff to help explain puberty and stuff and turn it into these jokes works really well. I'm surprised that it came from somebody who I know for weird sort of offbeat comedy like Nick Kroll.
Yeah, I am not expecting myself to be sitting here bragging about something Nick Kroll created, but yeah. I absolutely dig it. The cast is hilarious, and honestly, it's the type of thing that you can kind of put on in the background and goof off to a little bit. It might be perfect to catch over the next couple of weeks and months as our calendars start to get wild and our days start to shift, and you maybe don't want to get too dedicated to something because you're around family or whatever else, but it's on Netflix. It's definitely something that you may enjoy. And I think that leads us to the larger conversation here because, Dianna, I think everything that we're going to be talking about tonight comes from your list of things that turn you on. Because we're going to dive into some of your selections for some movies to maybe watch with the family to, I guess, push a little bit of sex positivity, to push a little bit of feminism and the, oh so evil queer agenda, so that when you are in that moment where it's the Friday after Thanksgiving and you have been watching football all day and you're sick of being around family and you just want everybody to shut the hell up, and somebody is reaching for an old copy of White Christmas and you just can't fucking watch that movie again. These are some hot takes. So With that in mind, let's go ahead and jump into it. What was the first movie you wanted to talk about tonight?
Yeah, I am really happy with the 2018 movie Booksmart. I
Hmm.
think it is a beautiful twist on the sort of coming of age movies. My friend described it to me as like these two teen girls go off and try to do their own super bad, but it's not misogynistic in that way. It is these two teen girls who realize on the night before graduation that they have done all the like book smart things. They have gotten good grades, they've gotten into good colleges and stuff, and they completely missed out on the partying side of high school. They missed out on those teenage adventures. Um, and so they go out and try to seek those out, and it turns into this entire bumbling night of comedies of errors. They get taken to the wrong places. They end up like exploring different things and getting into some dangerous situations, and the entire time it's about this friendship between two girls who are heavily supportive of each other, have an open talkative relationship that talks about everything from masturbation to their crushes to the sexual experiences they have or have not had. And so one of the girls is a lesbian, the other one is her very enthusiastic straight ally. And there's one like sex scene in the entire thing, but the way it's played is for jokes really, and it's still
Hmm.
very sex positive, even though it's not a the scene is very like cringe, but it's
Sure,
still
yeah.
very sex positive. There's no like, oh my gosh, you're going to ruin your life by doing this sort of
Yeah,
thing.
so a non-rapey, female-centered Superbad
Yes.
is kind of like a pretty effective pitch all on its own.
Mhm.
But talk about why this was a pick for you when it comes to sex positivity. What was some of the modeling that you saw, or what worked in that movie that you feel like might be worth sort of sneaking in when you've got like family sitting around that you might want to maybe trick into learning something?
Yeah, it's part of the joke of the movie is that the lesbian in the relationship in the friendship has never had sex, never experienced anything. She's a virgin. And so it's about her learning like how to as a lesbian, as a queer woman,
Mm,
which is really fascinating to me because that's not a story that gets told. That like, you know, queer people don't just come out and just know how to do these things. We have to actually educate them,
sure.
like how straight people like don't just automatically know. And stuff. And so it's a fun twist on that lack of education being a source for humor, and a source for growth in a lot of ways, where she learns about herself and about what she likes and doesn't like, which is pretty
Yeah.
sex positive.
No, and I'm glad that we're starting here because we didn't talk about this before the show. But this is actually a movie that I saw in theaters with my mother. And if I had tried to pitch her on anything that
Hmm.
was sort of sex positive or queer oriented or that had that in the tagline, it would have been
Hmm.
at best an uphill battle. It probably would have gotten shut down right away, but she was excited to see it. She, I think, maybe even brought me to that picture.
Hmm.
And as you're watching it, it doesn't feel preachy. It didn't feel like they
Hmm.
were pushing an agenda. It was just a movie. And the people in that movie were having healthy conversations about sex. We're learning and growing and developing as people. I mean, it worked really well for me on that level.
Yeah, it's definitely one that, like, the next time I go and visit my brother and sister-in-law, we usually end up sitting down and watching a movie together in the evening after the nieces have gone to bed. I can see us sitting down and watching that movie together and getting a laugh out of it, which is really good for like a good family time movie.
Yeah, and I don't know how resonant this narrative is for everybody, but I just know in my family there's always that thing around the holidays where it's
Mhm.
like everybody wants to be together, but nobody really wants to do anything or say anything. We have nothing in common. We've already like sort of taxed whatever connections or whatever like utility we get out of being around each other.
Yeah.
but we still want to try and figure out a way to make it work. And that's usually when, somebody goes to put on like a random episode of Breaking Bad or something. And it's like, that's not a bad show, but that's not working for me here. So I love that recommendation. What else do you think would work for when the whole family is like coming together to sit and watch a movie at the same time?
The other one that we have on the list is one that's a little bit controversial, but I think would actually spur a lot of conversation.
Yeah.
Was Promising Young Woman.
Perfect. I love it.
Yeah. It is a movie about a young woman who has dropped out of medical school and decides to spend her time trying to get revenge on men, basically for her friend's rape during medical school. So it's dealing with a heavy topic, but it's doing so in a way that is incredibly intriguing, to the point where it almost becomes a thriller in points, and it's a very interesting, well-acted movie that takes... One of my favorite things about the movie is the casting, because it takes all these guys who are known for playing nice guy characters and casts them in the role of these like lecherous men.
Yeah, it sleazes them up a little bit. Yeah.
It's so fascinating. And that's one that I think would definitely get conversation started among family in a lot of ways. It's not necessarily one that like young kids can watch, but it's definitely one where like you can watch with your adult cousins and then talk about as a group.
Yeah. Everybody's family dynamic's going to be a little different. So I guess we should mention that a lot of these, and this one in particular, is R-rated, but I don't feel like it would be necessarily an uncomfortable movie to watch with your parents. And it's definitely it's gripping, and there's enough humor to it. And I think maybe one of the better selling points is that it's incredibly tight. Like I would have to check, but I think the runtime is probably like 90, maybe 100 minutes.
It's a short, tight little movie, but leaves you with a big impact. And stuff, and so it's really a good one for like just distracting everybody in the evening. So
well, and I'm going to be really careful about spoilers here. We'll go ahead and continue this conversation without, I think, ruining any of these films. We really do want to encourage folks to be curious about some pretty great movies here. But I'll say that there are definitely some tropes in this picture that turn some things that are maybe turn on their head in a little way. Like the ending in particular, I think is one of those like headline, like, oh Jesus, did they really do another movie with that shitty trope? But in a way that really works. And I think there's so much about this movie that makes us question the way we think about maybe bar culture and about, good old boys and nice guys and a lot there, without really seeming preachy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one that is intriguing and goes for good discussions and stuff. And I'm the type of person who, after I watch a movie, will sit down and discuss it with you and be like, okay, so what about this scene and what about that scene and all that. So
yeah, no, there's a lot to talk about here. And I guess I'm curious how you feel about some of the violence in this picture, because it feels like it's tastefully done in some ways. I mentioned that even though we don't want to spoil anything, it's certainly a film that depicts violence against women in a way that I think could veer into like some pretty exploitative, like cringy type of territory. But that wasn't my experience of this one.
Yeah, no, it really, I think part of it is because it's written and directed by a woman and uses women throughout the directing and throughout the editing and stuff. It doesn't delight in the violence. It uses it as a like sort of thriller gripping trope, but it's not a movie where you feel like it's overindulging in that violence.
Yeah, fair to say. Well, I wanted to kind of throw out one of my own quickly, if I may. Was there anything else you wanted to make sure to touch on here?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, well, I wanted to maybe just very briefly mention the film Coda, which garnered a lot of attention last Oscar season. And this one would actually be perfect, I think, for kind of the whole family. There is some sexuality that is, I don't know if graphic is maybe the term I would use, but it's definitely noticeable. It comes in with a PG-13 rating, but the sex is played for laughs in a way that is really humanizing, I felt. Ultimately, this is a movie, of sort of a coming of age story about a young girl. She is the child of deaf adults, Coda, if you're not familiar with that term.
Yeah.
And it sort of explores not just the sexuality piece, but also working in and out of different forms of marginalization, different forms of sort of finding your own voice and some maybe subtle and perhaps not so subtle ways. It really brings some of that like cheese factor that you're maybe looking for in a good family film in a lot of ways. And I think would be a really good selection if you are looking for something that just doesn't have all of the cringe that we are kind of used to when we're looking to have like a more sex positive, more progressive view on things. I want to remind folks that we do have lines open, and we'd love to hear your take on a lot of these films, to maybe get some of your recommendations on what you feel like would be a good way to pass or even kill some time with family this year. But Dianna, while we're having this conversation, I guess I wanted to hear maybe what your thoughts or your experiences are kind of generally when it comes to some more like classic Christmas fare, because I think a lot of what we're doing here is wanting to just avoid having to sit through Miracle on 34th Street for the millionth time, as you know the women are being sidelined, and as you know the men are men, and you know some of those like traditional tropes. And I guess just what it means to be returning year after year after year to some of this art that is part of our culture, and that I'm not like trying to cancel or erase or anything, you know, that a conservative boogeyman might make it out to be, but that is still perhaps problematic. I don't know. Do you have any anything you might add to that, or any thoughts there?
Yeah, it's interesting how like particularly like white American Christmas, like Christian culture, has developed this relationship with these movies from very specific time periods. Like, I think it's TBS does a 24/7 marathon of A Christmas Story.
Yeah.
And you kind of wonder, who is that for at this point? Because like it's 2021, that movie came out in what, the 80s?
Well, and not to mention anybody can watch that movie at any time on any number of platforms. Like, we don't necessarily need a network to just broadcast and rebroadcast it for us.
Yep. And so I feel like it started as a gimmick that they were doing, but now has become something of a Christmas tradition. And it's kind of this weird like cultural touchstone for that, where some families will just turn it on. Like my dad will just put on TBS during the day during that time. And it's very strange because you end up catching the movie at different times as you walk in and out. And it sort of forms background noise, but it's when you sit down and actually watch some of these movies, they're not great movies, because they all depend on this like idea of like, well, everything will be made right when man and woman kiss at the end of the movie and everything's okay. And stuff. And it's like, that's tired. That's old. And stuff. And I'm just, it's like we are watching these movies like It's a Wonderful Life over and over again without learning the lessons from the movies, or just only like taking them away at Christmas time of like, oh, this is a time when it's good to give and stuff, without ever actually landing back on that outside of the Christmas period. It seems like a way to just sort of make ourselves feel better.
Yeah,
and
and
engaging with the nitty gritty.
The message of it. Yeah, and I can appreciate something of that sense of tradition.
Mhm.
And I can even make some excuses for older films. Like you're talking about A
Mhm.
Christmas Story, and the thing that jumps out for me, of course, is the scene at the Chinese restaurant, which is
Mhm.
really not the best way I've ever seen Asian Americans depicted on film. There's definitely some concern there,
Yeah.
but I'm willing to, in certain ways, like give a pass to some of these things. We were talking with the crew before the show about the film Airplane, which is definitely a
Mhm.
movie that I grew up loving, and that I maybe haven't seen it in a while, so perhaps I should hedge a bit in case it doesn't hold up quite as well as I think. But certainly, I do know and remember that there are some scenes there that you wouldn't include in any sort of remake if you were going to do that movie again, and rightly so. I
Mhm.
don't know that that means that the whole movie needs to be thrown into the bin. And I don't know that necessarily any of these movies that we're perhaps poking fun of need to be completely trashed. But there is something to be said about the way that we glamorize them and return to them over and over, even as
Yeah.
those messages become increasingly not just stale, but rancid in many cases.
Yeah, I think of Love Actually, which is considered like an ultimate Christmas movie. It's about the 6 weeks leading up to Christmas. It's all about how Christmas is all around, and stuff, and how, like, that movie doesn't hold up all that much because it's very concentrated on straight couples. It's very, um it's it's one that just to me doesn't resonate anymore, in
Hmm.
terms of like what it's trying to tell us about Christmas, because all the expressions of love within it are like these romantic love sort of things rather than like love between friends, things like that,
Familial,
or
or yeah.
having, and it equates in a lot of ways love with sex, which is not necessarily a healthy message to be sending out there. And stuff, especially with like the ways in which like Alan Rickman's character is cheating on his wife, and that's like the big storyline for him and stuff, and how, like, how does that look like love? How does that, um how do we deal with that is a complicated question that I think the movie doesn't deal with properly and stuff. So when we're putting that on every Christmas, it's kind of like, well, what are we saying about other kinds of love that exist?
Taking that in over and over. Yeah.
Yep.
No,
Which is,
we
yeah.
actually did something of a deep dive on Love Actually last year,
Oh,
and
cool.
I do want to say that I enjoy that movie. But
Mhm.
at least another piece of this is wanting to introduce something that is kind of fresh, and that doesn't necessarily entail just that idea of Christmas. I know it's
Mhm.
kind of a little bit unfair to have this conversation about Christmas movies and then for us to come in with all of these movies that you could watch at really any time of the year. But as an atheist, I know that by the time like December 30th has rolled around,
Mhm.
if I have to hear one more word about that goddamn kid freezing in the manger, my head feels like it'll explode. And I just get
Yeah.
so exhausted of hearing about it.
Mhm. Yeah, the Christmas season really tires me out in a lot of ways, and I feel that where like like I will go get Chinese food on Christmas Day or something, if I'm spending it alone because I don't want to deal with Christmas dinner or whatever, those sorts of things. And stuff. And it just gets tiring. And sometimes you just want something that is not Christmas themed to deal with. Because at this point, I went to the store this last weekend, and they were already playing Christmas music. And I
Oh,
was like, it
wow.
is
Yeah,
barely
that's bad
November.
form.
Yeah. Um, and stuff. So like at this point, we're dealing with it for like 3 months, and I I get tired.
Yeah, I don't know if it's like a sensory processing issue or
Mhm.
what, but even as a theist, just any form of repetitive music, and Christmas music
Mhm.
certainly falls into that category, makes my brain just start to feel like it's melting after a certain period of time. So I do hope that if anybody is catching the podcast of this as they are driving towards family or whatever
Mhm.
else, that we can give you at least a little bit of break from all of that. I will say that this year on Thanksgiving, we will be doing an episode of Sexuality, and it is going to be rather spectacular. I haven't seen all of the final cuts, but we were able to film live on set, or on location rather, and it was a very, very good time. I think y'all will be super excited about it. So if you need the excuse, if you have the opportunity to sneak away from family, we'll be premiering that live on Thanksgiving night. And certainly if it gives you an excuse to maybe rustle the remote away from somebody else on Friday morning or whenever you can, it'll be a really good time. But with that, I wanted to dip into our mailbag a little bit and get your take on a message that we received this week. Help me out here, because I'm maybe struggling a little bit with what this person is asking, but I feel like you would have some good insight here. The email starts off, first off, I don't think I've ever heard of this situation actually happening, but I can think of 2 stories with this trope in it. Basically, boy really likes girl, girl is not interested in boy, boy fakes being trans, boy is now accepted as one of the gal pals of the girl, boy goes to sleep over with girl and her friends. I can't help but think that some of the people that use these stories as fodder for accusing other people of being trans trenders or being creeps who want to be allowed in what are generally considered women or girl-only spaces for the purpose of oogling people in a state of semi-undress. Any thoughts? How can you weigh in on this, Dianna?
Yeah, that reads to me as an anti-trans talking point that has been turned into sort of a fiction trope. And stuff, because there's nobody who reasonably is changing their name, changing their pronouns, pretending to be trans in order to look at the boys, look at girls, or look at people in undress, and stuff. There are
it is a strange trope that shows up in media maybe more than we would expect it to, especially since it is not a practical thing that I think has ever happened, perhaps really in the history of Everest.
Most of the time, if a person wants to ogle another person, they're going to do it. They're not going to go to all these special lengths. And I think the way that we see it usually in media is that it's played for laughs. And stuff. One example of a similar trope that comes to mind is there's this episode of Scrubs where Elliot is convinced that Todd, the ultra masculine surgeon who talks about having sex all the time, is actually gay, and he's just pretending to be ultra masculine in order to cover up for that. And so she starts treating him as one of the girls, because obviously he as a gay person, wouldn't have any interest in her. So she takes him bra shopping with her.
Because all gay guys are super excited to go bra shopping with their gal pals. That's definitely a thing that makes sense in the real world.
Yes, and it's this thing where it plays off the idea that Elliot is just naive and doesn't realize that, no, Todd is a straight man who is just a pig, sort of thing. And it's sort of, this feels like a further version of that, and stuff where the joke is on the girls who accept this manipulative boy into their midst. But that's not a thing that happens in the real world. There are not people who are changing their names, changing their pronouns, wearing clothing that is completely different for them, making starting to put on makeup or doing things that are completely different to their personality just in order to get a look at you in your underwear. That's way too much effort for most people to go to in order to do that. And so I think we can safely set this aside as a fiction trope that is very out there. It's something that doesn't reflect the real world. It's played for comedy, but it's not a thing that exists, and it's not a thing people have to worry about in the real world. And I think people who look at the fiction trope and try to apply it to trans people in real life are just looking for an excuse for their bigotry in a lot of ways. I think you're muted. Sorry.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I'll take that. Like, yeah, it is a fiction trope, and then people try to misapply it to real life. At the same time, I'm wondering where this art is coming from. Like, I'm comfortable with the idea of us sort of making up ridiculous scenarios as a way of like sort of playing through or exploring some of our fears, and using art as a way to play and like work out some of these things. Is it true then? Is it fair then that there's a market for this story because people are afraid of this? Or is the fear coming from the art? What does that relationship look like in your mind?
I'm not entirely sure. I would have to look. I think that sort of thing comes on a case-by-case basis. I think with the trope itself, it comes from a lot of cis men thinking like, okay, how could I use this trans thing, like, or something like that as a fun trope when I'm writing fiction or something, or out of the fears of cis women in a lot of ways, who are afraid of this new trans thing, this thing that they think is new but is actually centuries
Sure,
old.
right.
And stuff. So I'm not sure. That's something where it's like, where you kind of like, you should be interrogating yourself, whether you are the writer or the consumer of those arts, and think about, okay, what does this say about this marginalized group? What does this say about the people in the story? What do I think of the characters in that story, and stuff? And what does that like mean for me as I relate to queer people in my life, or as I meet trans people? And stuff like that. So that's something that I always promote, being a conscious consumer of the art that you're looking at, and stuff, especially when it comes to stories that involve marginalized groups in a lot of ways.
Yeah, well, and this is definitely not a new story. I mean, we can name countless examples of various forms of this. I mean, going back to Brian De Palma comes to mind, and I'm forgetting the name of that picture, but Sorority Boys was one that my partner and I were talking about last night as something that came out when we were in high school that was messy in a lot of ways. But I don't want to get, I guess, too carried away with this conversation but I wanted to check in to see if you had any thoughts or tips or tricks or any other insight into how to be that conscientious consumer, how to notice your relationship with this kind of art, particularly like you said, when we're talking about marginalized folks. Are there warning signs? Are there things that we should be noticing or preparing for?
Yeah, my strategy whenever I'm having like an emotional or fearful reaction, and this comes from decades of having an anxiety disorder, is to ask myself, where is this fear coming from? Where is this emotion coming from? Is my brain just trying to hype me up about something, or is there an actual real fear here? And stuff. And so I think there's a lot of people who think they can just mindlessly consume media and like it won't affect them in any way, but it really kind of does. And stuff, especially when it is about marginalized groups that we don't encounter in our everyday. And so if you are wanting to be a more conscientious consumer, take the time to name whatever emotions you are feeling in response to that media, and ask yourself, where's that coming from? Why do you feel that way? And how does that make you see people differently in a lot of ways? Because I think stories have this power to make not only the marginalized group feel seen, but to make other people understand that they're real lives. So we always want to ask, whenever there's media involving a marginalized group, what it is saying about that group, and what sort of thing an audience would take away from that.
Well, and include them in the creation of it. I mean, you mentioned the involvement of women in the creation of Promising Young Woman, which, feels silly considering something like 50.5, 51% of all humans are women. And yet, still thoroughly underrepresented, still kind of like hard to put into positions of power in Hollywood. So I guess take notes, Sia, if you're listening, when you next time you make a movie, like involve people from that community.
Yes.
Well,
Yeah, and you can see that a lot in Booksmart too,
Mm.
because that was an all-female writing team and stuff, and it's very the characters feel real in a lot of ways. And you can see that when you've got people either writing about a group that they're not a part of or writing from the standpoint of being in that group.
Well, we've got a bunch of really interesting movies that I'm excited to continue talking about. But before we do, let's take a moment and see what's been going on around the rest of the ACA. Yeah, it's a generally good idea to not just go up and tug on anybody's tail under any circumstances, but in particular, if that tail is connected to somebody's rectum, you could be doing some damage.
Then you're probably going to get the first bit of life, and then when those bits of life interact with other bits of life, new bits of life happen, and then suddenly you got people and the internet and JFK conspiracies and all kinds of stuff.
Dude, we gotta get our TV show picked up by Netflix. Like, what do we do? What do we add? Like, let's like impregnate people with parasitic eggs.
Michael wants to talk about how to talk to theists. I'm speaking your language, right, Nate? With the aboot, right? That's
yeah. Oh yeah.
It's
You
just,
betcha,
it's just
bud.
cultural sensitivity.
I can summarize that, which is,
hey, I think you're really cool, Matt. I don't think you've had a good conversation with a really smart theist, but I'm a really smart theist, and Sam Harris agrees with this point that I made, and somebody else agrees with this point that I made. So let me point out how science actually presupposes the existence of God, and that philosophical naturalism, which I know you don't hold to, which is irrelevant to this.
I mean, you just keep going and going and going. Try decaf, first of all.
Oh, every time I see myself in one of those recaps, I just imagine just how proud my mother must be of me and all of the things that I've accomplished in my storied career.
Especially with that particular one, not tugging on people's tails.
Yeah, well, you know what? I don't know that it gets better on any of the others. We talk about some fun stuff here. And let's do some more of that. Your next movie is actually one that we dived into in detail last year, but I am so curious to hear your take on it because we were split and didn't know what to make of it. So what did you think? Let us know.
Yeah, the movie Happiest Season. Kristen Stewart, who is, my wife, who is unfortunately getting married to a real life wife.
It's unfortunate.
Yeah. But it is basically a Hallmark Christmas movie starring a lesbian couple. And it was received, as you said, to mixed reviews and stuff, because the entire plot of it is that the Harper, the woman that Kristen Stewart is in a relationship with, hasn't come out to her family yet. And she sort of springs this on her partner on the way to the family's house and stuff. And it's sort of, they think you're my roommate rather than my girlfriend, which is admittedly kind of a terrible spot to put somebody in.
Sure, yeah.
In a lot of ways. And it goes from there. There are the usual like Christmas hijinks and stuff, but a lot of it is, will Harper come out and will it turn out okay? In a lot of ways. And it's one that, like for me watching it as a queer person, it felt like, oh, thank goodness there's a Christmas movie that includes us, that acknowledges that we exist, and that
we also get a shitty Hallmark movie.
Yeah, that's the sort of thing. It's not one that that I'm like, oh, this is representative of my experience or anything, because I've never been the child of a politician in a small town, that sort of thing. But it hits on a lot of those tropes that are common in straight Hallmark movies, in movies featuring heterosexual couples. And it feels kind of good to be included in that genre in a lot of ways, even though we can take a sex positive lens to it and say okay, this is not a necessarily healthy relationship, but then neither are the straight couples in Hallmark movies. That's kind of a hallmark of those movies. and stuff. So it feels like we've made it as sort of queer people to have our own shitty movies in a lot of ways, and that's part of why I
can
enjoy
appreciate
it.
that
Yeah.
narrative. Like, hey, not every movie about queer people needs to be Oscar baity. Like, maybe we can
Yeah.
just also have queer bad movies.
Yeah.
And I guess I should mention the category that we're maybe talking about now, if this isn't like too arbitrary of a label, is like background movies.
Mhm.
Movies that are good to have on while you're cooking dinner. And as that, it really works for me because it's a dumb, silly Hallmark movie that you can have on in the background while you're cooking dinner. And if your mom happens to walk in to help you peel the potatoes, it is kind of reinforcing the idea that, hey, queer and lesbian couples are just couples. Like it normalizes that notion. So I definitely appreciate that. But it felt to me like very much a movie about gay people for straight people.
Yes.
And maybe that's what it needs to be for my
Yeah.
mom to watch it. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I feel like that's accurate. And stuff. We're still at a point where a lot of queer culture has straight people as the audience, in terms of like trying to make our existence palatable. And there's a lot of disagreements to be had about like whether or not we should be doing that or whatever. And stuff. But this is one that it is relatively inoffensive. When I saw it for the first time last year, I texted my sister-in-law with, this would be a fine one for you to show my oldest niece, who just turned 11. And it's one of those things where it's just it's an inoffensive Christmas movie, which is good.
Yeah. If you
different.
need one of those in your back pocket, this is a good one to have because it does push a certain narrative. And my feeling about it, like it's written by, or at least in part by, Clea Duvall, who is just a icon of mine, but who based it on her own true to life experience. But I think it's kind of clear that it was true to life like 20 years after the fact in a lot of ways. And so even when it first came out, it felt dated a little bit, but maybe that's what you need for that background inoffensive sort of movie. So maybe this is not the one to get all excited about and to all sit down on the couch for, but it's got its place here. Yeah.
Yeah. It's something to put on instead of football or some other random Christmas movie about straight people. Like it's something new, which is refreshing in the middle of a season where like so much is repeated.
Yeah. Well, when we're, I guess, talking about like classics that we've seen over and over again, your next movie is definitely in that category for me. So I just love to have this on the background kind of any time of year. It might even be extra perfect when there's like family sort of around. But tell us about it.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite queer comedies, But I'm a Cheerleader. It is a comedy about conversion therapy, which feels like
not easy to do.
No,
that feels like a very tough phrase to say.
But it does a good job of like laughing at these very painful things and making it into sort of this hijinks comedy of like, well, these people are under some very real pressure, but they are also experiencing and learning about themselves, and everything is so over the top that it becomes funny. And it's a good way for queer people to laugh at the pain of some of these experiences in a good way. And it's a good, like, it does a really good job of like normalizing queer relationships while also like talking about how it's hard because there are these people in the world who think we're abnormal or something like that, but these people end up happy and alive and in better situations. And stuff. I don't think it's spoiling anything to say that the movie has a happy ending, and stuff, which is good to see in queer movies.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And it's a lot of fun, and there is a certain silliness to it. But without wanting to like prop myself up as some sort of deep thinking art critic, I do really appreciate that idea that we talked about a moment ago of sort of exploring your fears through these like outsized boogeyman characters.
Yes.
And this has that, because the notion of conversion therapy is sort of dressed up into that archetype of the like mean head mistress in such a way that I feel like anybody can relate to, even if they have never been to or been threatened with or been afraid of going to like a conversion camp. I think we've all had that sort of like camp boarding school type experience with the asshole in charge. And there's a relatability there.
Yeah, and there's also a lot about how like men and women have these special roles and stuff. And there's one point where one of the very effeminate men there just goes, "I wasn't meant to be a butch," and it's this thing about like performing this masculinity for others and learning how to be not toxically masculine in a lot of ways. And not like you don't have to be overtly feminine. One of my favorite jokes in the movie is the character of Jan, who is just simply gender nonconforming. She's not actually gay. She says so in the movie, but she's been sent to this camp because she's not your typical woman. And so it's this sort of like wanting to teach people how to be a woman, and sort of lampshades that concept that like society has of telling people that, oh, you have to, in order to be a woman or a man, you have to be this way or that way, and stuff, when it's really just fine to be yourself.
Yeah. Do you feel like this is something that you can like readily get away with when it comes to family? The aesthetic, I think, has a certain appeal. How difficult of a pitch would this be, you think?
To some family, probably not too hard of a pitch, and stuff, especially like I come from a very conservative family, so like it's very dependent upon like a movie that acknowledges the existence of queer people, let alone lampshades, sort of Christian conservative therapy, would not pass with them. But if you've got a family that is queer friendly, that makes jokes about gender and stuff like that, like they would probably love this movie if they haven't seen it already.
And I almost wonder how many folks listening might be able to get this one in under the radar before anybody realizes that it's farce. Before anybody realizes like there's enough about it that's sort of extreme and out there and ungrounded, so that you don't even necessarily know that you're being lampooned as the like ultra conservative Christian until you get fairly deep into it in certain ways.
Yeah. Yep. And I would also want to watch it just to see who recognizes RuPaul.
Yeah, that's fair. That's a good pitch in and of itself. A lot of young talent in that one.
Yeah, yep. Yeah, the thing that I went and rewatched it this week. It's free on YouTube, which was a surprise. And it's not like a pirated thing. It's actually like
right, like it's actually available on YouTube.
But like one of the like jock actors is Dante, who did the voice of Zuko in Avatar: The Last Airbender. I forget his last name, but his first name is Dante. And he, like, when he showed up, I was like, oh, hey, like, I recognize that young guy. And so it has a lot of those moments too, where you're like, oh, this has a cast of like a bunch of like queer Hollywood, or like just young Hollywood at the time. So.
And a totally banging soundtrack.
Yes.
The 90s like pop punk emo type stuff that works really well in the background.
Yep.
I'm just going to mention briefly, my quick pick is maybe a little bit of a tougher sell in a lot of ways, but it's got similar aesthetic musically, and it's just sort of a lot of fun as a good background movie. Certainly, I think people watching it will likely be familiar with Hedwig and the Angry Inch, but it might be one of those movies like Rocky Horror or some of those cult classics that you've spent more time saying that you've seen than have actually spent seeing it. And I really want to recommend, if you have been sort of on the fence, if you've been waiting, don't. Like, it holds up. It is a good time. The music is legitimately solid, and it's got a lot to say. There is a maybe loudness or a crassness to it that is kind of the perfect anecdote for a lot of the things that we've been talking about, like a lot of the really cloying, saccharine sweet type of Christmas bullshit. Hedwig and the Angry Inch will cut through that like a rock opera with an attitude, and is definitely something worth checking out.
Yeah, absolutely. That is one of those queer movies that I have not yet seen, but I need to, and I think you just sold me on it.
Yeah, well done. All right. Well, they say if you can reach just one person, that it was all worth it. So
Yes.
I am proud to be here with you tonight. But let's take a jump onto the phones and hear from some of our viewers about their movie questions and thoughts. Mr. Krabs in Maryland, you are on the line. What movie do you want to bring up for us tonight?
Hey, so yeah, I had a little bit of an experience with the movie 27 Dresses when I was dating my partner, who I later married, and kind of like the expectations of romance in Hollywood and how it's really skewed. So I'm not going to go too deep into the plot because I'm sure nobody cares.
Nobody remembers the plot, and I think everybody watching this show right now saw the movie. Like, I think it's fair to say that 105% of our viewers probably caught this romantic comedy from 10 years ago.
Okay, cool. 10 years? No, I think it's like 15 years by this
15?
point.
That might be. You're probably right. The numbers just keep getting bigger and bigger.
Linear progression of time. What are you going to do about it? So my partner saw this movie by herself and really enjoyed it and wanted me to see it. And one of the ways that she tried to convince me was like, oh, the lead love interest, the guy, he reminds me so much of you, talking about me. And I'm like, okay, fine, whatever. We'll watch this movie. There's going to be stipulations where I won't go into, but sure, we'll watch this movie. And we'll watch this movie, and he steals the lead protagonist's planner. And I'm like, oh no. Oh no. And then he just starts showing up at places where she's at. And doesn't bother to tell her, oh, by the way, here's your planner, that's your entire life. And I'm thinking, it's like, wait. You're trying to tell me that this person reminds you of me. Are you trying to say, like, I'm some weird stalker who will then lie to you? And
I was hoping you were going to tell us that you look like James Marsden, but it does sound a little more insidious the way you describe it.
Yeah, no, I don't think I've ever been described as James Marsden. That I don't think is something I could pull off. But yeah, it's like, how could you think that I'm this terrible person? He is not a good guy. And you talk about different expectations and romance, like, the guy kisses the girl and everything, turns out to be, better. I think that's, one of the main plot points of The Notebook, which I've never seen. All I know is they were, yelling at each other in the rain. how do we tell our partners that these movies are just not good?
Yeah, we could do this show for 100 years, and I don't
Mhm.
know that I would come up with quite the right words for letting your partner know that their favorite romantic comedy is not a good movie. I might have to refer you to a totally different show about high conflict relationships or something along those lines. But I hear your point that, you know, a lot of these movies, particularly when we're talking about romantic comedies and sort of like family comedies and things like that, they're not meant to be serious art. And there is room for plots that don't necessarily make sense and for, you know, just a cute vehicle for chemistry and jokes and things like that. And that's all fine. But so many of these movies have like really disgusting behavior, particularly on the part of men, that's incredibly toxic. And if it showed up one time or two times, you would say like, oh, well, you know, it's silly writing. Like you don't have to get too involved with it. But it feels endemic. I mean, would you agree to that, Diana?
Yeah, that was one of the things that was part of my like baby feminist awakening, was watching romantic comedies and realizing like that these women are settling for men who are terrible and doing these like super creepy things like showing up at their work or things like that, and stuff. And so I think part of it is that the movie, because it ends with such a happy ending and you've got like the wedding and the music swelling and all that, we just sort of forget that it was like that the relationship was like that, or that person had behaved in that way. It's designed for us to be put in the position of the girl being charmed by this man, even as he is behaving in ways that are boundary crossing in normal life. And I'm sure,
Well,
caller, that the that your now wife did not mean that she found you as a stalker, but as she found you charming, and was probably thinking of the Benny and the Jets scene where they get drunk in a bar and end up singing together, and that's like the big romantic moment of the movie. And stuff. But yeah, it does get into weird territory when you're comparing your partner, especially, to somebody who is a somewhat creepy and cynical stalker in a movie.
It almost seems like the caveman mentality, like, you know, oh, I'm going to conquer or wear somebody out, and then they'll have no choice. And you know, thankfully after that, you know, she started to see, okay, yeah, no, he really is terrible. And I think the last rom-com that she made me suffer through was Leap Year. And it was, you know, again, I sat her down and I'm just like, look at how terrible this person is. And she's like, yeah, you're right. I hate it that you're right, but you know, it was. Look, I don't have to see rom-coms anymore, so I'm happy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they have kind of stopped making them in a lot of ways, and I would like to say it's because we are a post-Me Too, more feminist society that is more aware of these things, and maybe there's some water in that, but I think it has more to do with like the shrinking of the film industry in the middle and how there are like more indie films and big budget films, but not a whole lot of those like affordably made middle budget movies. I don't know. Is it at all fair to say that we're trending in a good direction, Diana? Do you think there's any truth to that idea?
I think so. I think like you said, there's not really that budget for it. Over the last decade, we've had the Marvel movies explode, and so you have a lot of studios who are trying to recreate that magic, sort of, and there haven't been a lot of romantic comedies that have been huge box office successes.
It's pretty much like just the Netflix original type stuff at this point.
Yeah, that sort of stuff, and that has its own like niche
Lifetime
audience. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's a whole separate tier.
Yeah. And I think because we have like studios like Netflix that are able to fund more diverse in a lot of ways. Things we get movies that are still like romantic comedies, but like are like the half of it, which was a movie I had considered for this show, which is a Cyrano de Bergerac type thing, but with a queer twist, where the Cyrano character is played by a woman who realizes that she's in love with the woman in the thing, and it turns out very happy. And it's starring like it's the star of it is an Asian actress and stuff, so it's more diverse than most romantic comedies. And I think with smaller studios making movies like that, we're seeing a lot more emphasis on things that are just better stories, because there's a lot more noise that people have to go through to get there with all the like internet studios and streaming. So
yeah, so ultimately, Mr. Krabs, I think the takeaway here is that traditionally when we watch these movies, all we're seeing is that the plot is set up, the music is set up, the lighting is set up, the cinematography is set up. Everything is set up to message over and over again, this guy is charming. Of course, when we actually look at the plot, not so much charming as like creepy, but when your partner is looking at you and thinking about this movie, or watching this movie and thinking about you, I think you can take that as a win. Even if maybe the message for us more generally is that, oh boy, we should be a little bit more mindful of the messages that we're taking in.
yeah.
I don't know. I'd rather be compared to like, a Tony Stark character or maybe a Captain America character by this point, especially since I definitely don't look like any of them.
Well, it's the modern era of films. There are fewer romantic comedies to compare you to, and a lot more big action tent poles. So, yeah, I guess just find that action hero that you think you might be able to pull off, and then drop some subtle hints.
Yeah.
All right.
But thank you so much for giving us a call tonight, and good luck. I'm glad to hear this relationship has survived its stalkery beginnings.
Oh yeah, going 10 years married. So,
hey, good on you! Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah, have a great night.
You too.
Yeah, I like to be a progressive humanist. I like to be somebody who believes that we are learning our lessons and that we're getting better. Maybe I am just getting more persnickety and more turning into like more of a skeptical, judgy asshole as I age. But I'm not entirely convinced. But nevertheless, it is interesting to look at the way that our opinions change about some of these things. I mean, whether we're talking about something really dated, like the movie Airplane, or something that is like fresh but dated, like Happiest Season, this is like no more clear to me than in your next movie, which has definitely had sort of a shift in cultural opinion. What do you have to say about it?
Yeah, so the next slate of movies that we're going to talk about are movies that you put on after everyone's gone to bed, sort of thing, where like you just need some time to like decompress from everything.
Thoroughly de-Christmas with like some late night action.
Yes, yeah, and the ones that I ended up suggesting are horror movies, because I'm a huge horror fan. Like we just got done with my favorite season ever, which was October Halloween season, and stuff. So this one is stars Megan Fox, and it's called Jennifer's Body, and it is a horror movie where things go wrong with this sort of like satanic sacrifice, and Megan Fox's character Jennifer basically leaves her body, but her body's still going on, and becomes like this killing machine that kills the men in her school in a lot of ways, and does it in like these graphic, violent sort of ways. And it's directed by a woman. I forget the name. I should have written it down, but the clear message of it is commentary on how women are literally objectified and turned into these walking models of like the male gaze and stuff, and it sort of turns that gaze back around and goes like, okay, this woman now has agency now that we've taken away everything that stops her, that inhibits her in a lot of ways. And that is really refreshing. It's a really refreshing take on horror movies where usually the women are the first to go. And stuff until the like final pure girl survives.
Right,
So it's
yeah,
a
the
it's
version
a
at
really
the end.
great commentary on that sort of thing, and of being like overtly sexual without like it's overt sexuality with the hint of danger for the men who are her victims in a lot of ways, but it's sort of punishing them for their objectification of her, which I really like in a horror movie.
You know, I mean, the way you describe it, it makes sense that it's here in this category. But I feel like in a lot of ways, it's a farce that we didn't read as farce for a decade. You know, in 2009, when this movie came out, if you had told me that, you know, a decade on, that I would be, first of all, that I'd be doing any of this shit, I wouldn't have believed you for a goddamn second. But that also I would be having this like nuanced conversation about the sexual ethics and saw it as anything other than what it looked like on the surface. I mean, if you only knew this movie from the previews that were playing back in 2009, you are seeing this like highly sexualized, vaguely sapphic relationship between Megan Fox, who was like hot off of the Transformers films and very much embodied all of the objectification and male gaziness that you're talking about. And the, you know, like Diablo Cody wrote it when she had just won the Oscar for Juno, and nobody seemed to get it. And as much as I really love, this is a great late night movie for me. This is absolutely one that I will get drunk and put on every couple of years. But I'm almost more interested in the conversation around this movie than around the movie itself, because the way we've interpreted it has changed so much in the last decade.
Yeah, it's been interesting to sort of go back and reinterpret it and realize that, like you said, Megan Fox was just coming off the Transformers movies, where she has spoken up about how she was treated on set by Michael Bay and objectified by him and like told to do like creepy sexualized things that were not good. It was not a healthy environment for her as an actress and stuff. And then to go on to this movie where she is the object taking back her subjectivity in a lot of ways, to use academic terms there, but she is the she is the victim, sort of turning that around and getting revenge on the men who had victimized her in a lot of ways. And that really is fascinating to watch, especially as we've watched Megan Fox. Like, I grew up going to the Transformers movies. Like, they started coming out when I was in high school, and I had grown up watching Shia LaBeouf on the Disney Channel. And to see like the trajectory of their two careers following the Transformer movies has been really, it says a lot about how women are treated in Hollywood and stuff. And I think the way we've reinterpreted that movie in light of the Me Too movement and in light of our like sort of national reckoning on sexual assault, especially in Hollywood, has been really fascinating to watch in a lot of ways. And I hope it's a movie that more people discover, because it's kind of a cult classic at this point, but like not a lot of people have actually seen it, at least not people in my friend groups.
Sure. And it really is a lot of fun. You've got this sort of like amped up, like metal kind of demonology and sexuality and all of these things, but in a way that is like at times perhaps very graphic, but it's even when it's being like graphic, it feels more like hyperbole. I mean, this is a movie that I feel like with a small number of edits probably could have slipped under that PG-13 line and is kind of just barely over it, even though it gives you the feeling of like, you know, of like metal, but like metal that you bought at Target, you know?
Yeah. it is very like, it's not a slasher film in the way that most horror movies are nowadays. Like there's been, over the last 10 years, we as a culture have really gotten into these slasher sort of movies, the Saw movies being really popular, the Purge movies.
Torture porn and that kind of body dysmorphia fears.
It doesn't go into that sort of body horror. So it's one of those that's much more of a psychological thriller in a lot of ways, even though there is gore. And it's really like fascinating in that way, in that it turns horror on its head. And I think that's also one of the reasons that it's been received differently in the decades since it came out, is because horror itself as a genre has changed to be like, to go back more to its roots as a social commentary. And so I could talk about horror for ages. So
yeah, well, and I dare anybody who hasn't seen it to go and watch a original trailer, like from the year that it came out, like a 2009 advertisement for this film, and then try and justify that with Diana's description of it as a psychological thriller. Because I don't think that you're wrong, but I also see how there's so much about that movie that kind of just went over all of our heads at the time.
Yep.
And, you know, I was very hormonal and at like a very particular age. So I was definitely interpreting Megan Fox's body, Jennifer's body, I mean, in a very different kind of lens. And so I'll just say that I have appreciated the opportunity to change my relationship with sort of movies from that era. I mean, Adam Brody is in it and gets his just desserts, and that's the most like 2009 thing that you've ever gotten to say.
Yeah, it's really fascinating in that way. In some ways, it's doing the same things as Promising Young Woman is, in terms of like casting. Like Adam Brody is that nice guy that everybody loved on the OC. He's the guy who invented oh gosh, what does he call it? It's not Festivus.
Oh, Chrismica.
Like, Chrismica. In the thing, like that's the thing that a lot of people knew him from, and so to see him like be a jerk who gets his just desserts and stuff in that movie is kind of satisfying in a lot of ways.
Oh, now I'm just wondering what happened to Rachel Bilson.
Yeah.
But you had one more movie for us, and this is one I actually haven't seen yet, so I'm really excited to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, this is one. It's also a horror movie that is very sex positive in a lot of ways, but the plot doesn't immediately strike you that way. It is called Cam, and it is a sort of found footage horror movie of a sex worker who does cam videos. She's a cam girl. She does
oh man, if you tell me that there is a horror movie about a cam girl, my head immediately goes to, you know, women chopped up in the freezer and like all of those sorts of tropes. So this is a hard pitch, but I'm excited to hear about it.
But this one takes it in a different direction, where she is somebody who is successful, has made her living off of this. She loves doing the work. Like it's a very positive portrayal of sex work, and she suddenly her entire career gets compromised by like this it's sort of half paranormal, half computer virus sort of thing that starts taking her identity online and starts like removing her ability to make money, to make her career, to do things that she has become accustomed to do. And like she tries to go to the police and they don't believe her because she's a sex worker and they don't want to do anything about it. And that's compounded by the fact that it's online and police are like, online stuff doesn't matter, sort of stuff, even though
so it's the net, but for sex workers.
Yeah, but it's never about punishing her for being a sex worker. The entire horror of it is that like something is happening to her and she is being gaslit by people around her. She doesn't know how to resolve this and stuff, and eventually like ends up like fighting with the computer, trying to get whatever this force or this entity is to give her her life back and stuff. And it's a very well built, tense horror that works really well, I think.
Yeah, well, and if we're going to talk about horror as sort of a like hyperbolic exaggeration
Mhm.
of our very real fears, I mean, we've had Amberly Rothfield on this show
Mhm.
a number of times talking about the deplatforming and the lack of banking access, and
Mhm.
we like have discussed what has been going on and off again and on with OnlyFans, and I mean,
Yes,
these are
yeah.
in some ways very real fears for a lot of folks in our audience. And I think that there's a lot of
Mhm.
merit to exploring that through art in this way.
Yeah, and it does it in a really interesting and fascinating way. Like the reason I put it on the list is that like it is not it is a movie where the sex worker is the victim, but not in the way that it's sort of this like, oh, she got killed because she was doing this or whatever.
Hmm.
Like it's much more nuanced, and it's much more um positive toward the concept of sex work than you would expect from typical horror movies, and stuff, which are usually about punishing women for having sex, whether or not they're getting paid for it.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and this is our late night horror film. But
Mhm.
how difficult of a pitch is this? If everybody's a little drinky and it's 11 o'clock and it's like just you and
Mhm.
dad in front of the TV, is this one that you can easily sell?
Not my dad. Getting him to watch Deadpool was hard. Um, but like I have a group of friends who are all like horror buffs, and I can see this being a movie that I could get them to sit down and watch. And stuff after our annual Christmas get together, kids have gone to bed, we're all sitting in the living room talking. We want to watch a horror movie. Yeah, I can see us putting it on. So,
Yeah. Well, sounds like a good time. I may
mhm.
actually do my best to catch it this weekend, but it'll be good to have it in my back pocket over the next 6 weeks or so as we're dealing with family and everything else. I'll throw out my quick pick real quick is the movie It Follows. If you haven't caught it, this is a great little semi-indie horror film. Really taut, really tense. It explores some like very interesting ideas around sexuality and particularly that experience of being a teenager where
Mhm.
you are like dealing with the stress and anxiety of sexuality in a world that is seemingly devoid of adults. You know, that's one of the most
Yeah.
interesting things about this movie when you watch it back is that there are no adults to be seen, even
Mhm.
as these teenagers are dealing with like some very uh, big picture, like adult types of problems. And it explores it in a way that is sex positive, but is also like very aware of sort of the
Mhm.
grunge and the grime and the grossness of that part of life. And I definitely think it's worth a watch and maybe a good late night palate cleanser when you've watched too many, sappy Christmas movies.
Yeah, that is one that when it first came out, that was one of the ones that I saw like right when it first came out. And it fascinates me as a movie, especially as a horror fan, because it turns that trope of like punishing people for having sex and punishing people for not being virgins and stuff on its head in such a way, and it's genuinely scary. Um, in so many spots, there are lots of good jump scares in it. So if you enjoy a good jump scare,
Atmospheric and
yes,
like scary, but also very easy to follow. I mean, there's
yeah,
very little plot.
yep,
The story is compelling enough. So to me, it really does fit that late night
mhm,
kind of vein.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, this has been a really fun conversation. I am excited about a lot of your recommendations and always excited to have you back on the show.
Mhm,
I'll say that if you didn't catch any of our recommendations or have some like further curiosities
mhm,
and want to learn a little bit more, that I'll make sure to have links in the show notes for this episode where I've got a listing of all of the films as well as some more commentary and some interesting articles that
mhm.
I read to get ready for this. But Dianna, where can people learn more about you and about your work and everything that you've got cooking right now?
Yeah, I am on Twitter at Dianna E. Anderson, and also on the web at diannaeanderson.net. If you follow me on Twitter, that is where you'll find all the updates about my upcoming work, about my articles that are going out, whatever. And I have a book coming out in July that I'll be announcing the title and the cover for soon. Pre-orders will be coming in January, my publisher said. So if you follow me on Twitter, you won't miss any of that.
Well, and we will definitely need to have you back to have a deeper conversation about your work as it comes out. I wasn't sure just how much of that was public and out into the world, but as more of it becomes available, and certainly as everything is released, we will be covering that very, very closely, and excited to see you again. But in the meantime, I want to remind everybody that if you are interested not just in this show, but in all of the shows that are being put together by the ACA, that you can catch them all in one convenient place. That's tiny.cc/AEN podcast, where you can hear an audio version of all of this programming. You can find some of the articles that I have been talking about, as well as an opportunity to help us come up with alternative titles for this episode, and to give us your thoughts and commentary. If you join us in the Secular Sexuality fan group that's on Facebook, you can catch that at tiny.cc/FBSSG, but just go ahead and search Secular Sexuality on Facebook, and I'll be there. You can definitely drop us a line. And then if you're catching this live on 11/11, as soon as we wrap up, we are going to be, Dianna and I, jumping into the Atheist Community of Discord. That's a great fan-run server that has a number of different conversations with Atheist Community of Austin guests. That's going to be at tiny.cc/ACD Discord. And then, of course, we want to mention that we've got merch available at tiny.cc/merchaca, where you can visit our store and collect all kinds of good gear and help us keep this show going. But the most important part of the night, I want to make sure to mention the folks that make Dianna and I able to have these conversations. Our incredible crew of folks, many of which are working all week, but certainly these three folks that have been here tonight helping us get all of this going. Thank you all so much for everything you do. And finally, to everybody watching, I hope you had a great time. I hope that you were introduced to some interesting ideas and maybe are curious about some movies to carry around in your back pocket, some lists to keep in mind over the holidays. But more than anything, I just appreciate that you are here and helping us to build a more sex-positive world that is free from the coercion of religion and free from the oppression that comes from misogyny and homophobia and all of these different things. If none of these movies are for you tonight, I just still so appreciate that you're the type of person that is working to make this world a better place. And with that in mind, if these are not the movies for you, not only are you wrong, but I definitely invite you to tell me about it. I would love to have this argument. There is nothing that satisfies me more than correcting other people's opinions about film, because certainly every thought I've ever had about any movie ever has been correct, and I would love to prove it to you. So please check us out by sending us an email. Join us on the Facebook group, wherever else. We would love to connect with you and just invite you to be a part of the atheist community of Austin. So with that, we'll hope to see you in the Discord soon. But in the meantime, this is a great opportunity, whether you are sneaking away from family during the holidays, or whether you are just taking a quiet moment to yourself after watching a sexy, gory film, to maybe go ahead and give yourself a big ol' orgasm. Or, better yet, give somebody else one.
Watch The Atheist Experience live Sundays at 4:30 p.m. Central. Visit tiny.cc/YTAXP and call into the show at 512-991-9242 or connect to the show online at tiny.cc/callaxp.